Samach Tet 69. And so we are like 8 lines down. First word on the line, ve'ema. But we are in the middle. And so if you recall, the discussion we had yesterday was about this complicated question of, in general, the simple part from our parsha this week, that a Bat Yisrael who marries a Kohen can eat Truma. A Bat Kohen who marries a Yisrael cannot eat Truma, right? They leave their father's house and go to their husband's house. If they then leave that house and go back home, quote unquote, because their husband dies or they get divorced, then they go back to their original status, unless they have children. And if they have children, then they don't go back, okay? So that was yesterday. And then we introduced this new halacha that we didn't like, that the psukim were thought were extra. And when it says a bat kohen, when she goes to an ish zar, can no longer eat truma, didn't just mean a bat kohen who marries a Yisrael. It meant a bat kohen who, and then we said from the word ve'bat, not just a bat kohen, but also bat Yisrael and a bat Levi, who sleep with a person who's zar, who's foreign to them, and they can never eat truma or marry a kohen again. Okay, and we gave a whole list of cases. We then asked, but all of that only made sense for people you can legally marry, right? Because it says bat kohen tihiyah. The word tihiyah implies that there's a connection. There's a havaya. There's a physical, not physical, but a halachic connection. And what about if a person who's a bat kohen or a bat Yisrael sleeps with a non-Jew, with an ovei kochavim, or with an eved? How do we know that that also is pasul for a kohen, for eating truma? And we said that was because the pasuk says that if she gets divorced, she goes back to her father's house. But obviously, in these cases, you can't get divorced, right? Because you were never really married. And so therefore, she's excluded based on that pasuk. Ask the Gemara today, the Ema, maybe, 7 lines from the top, maybe all the pasuk is telling you is Mishiyeshto Amunut V'Gerushinba, that a person who you can legally marry, meaning a Jew, that's where kilet le'zera ka'achla. Because remember, the Torah says if she gets divorced or her husband dies, right, or widowed, she goes back to her father's house only if she doesn't have children. If she does have children, she doesn't go back, right? She stays in her status because of the children. So maybe all the Torah is telling you that if you can legally marry because you have almanut gerushin, then when you don't have children and you're a bat kohen, ka'achla, then you go back to your father's house and you eat truma. But ki it le'zera, if you do have children, lo achla. But maybe the Torah is telling you that if a bat kohen sleeps with a man who's non-Jewish, so misha ein lo almanut v'gerushin ba, a person who they really can't, there's no marriage. You can say we're married, but there's halachically no marriage. So maybe afagav it le'zera namitichal. Maybe the Torah is telling me that even if she has a child, she can go back to her father's house because the child doesn't count. So maybe it's the opposite. Maybe it's not a chumrah, that, right, it's a kula. It's saying that the only time that a marriage with a child passes you from eating is if it's a real marriage. But if a bat kohen slept with a non-Jew or an eved and had a child, that child doesn't count as her yichus, right? It doesn't go after her. It doesn't. So maybe that's the case. Well, that can't be, because remember, we included also bat Yisrael and a bat Levi. Obviously, bat Yisrael and bat Levi are there to be more chamor, to add cases. This is not only a bat kohen, it's even a bat Yisrael and bat Levi. But if you're telling me it's lekula, there's nothing to be makel about bat Yisrael and bat Levi. If that was the case, in Cain, Rebuya, Levi, Yisrael, and so therefore it can't be the case. So it can't be a kula. It can't be saying it's easier if you don't have marriage. It must be saying it's harder if you don't have marriage. And what's harder is that if a bat kohen marries a Yisrael and he dies or divorces her and she has no children, she goes back home. But if she slept with or married a non-Jew, so there's no real marriage, but she slept with a non-Jew, then whether she has children or not, she never goes back home. She can never go back and eat food. So whether there's a kid or not a kid, the fact that she had a bia that's pasul makes her pasul from kahuna. Now, that only makes sense, the whole thing we said yesterday and today, if the word ki tihiyeh means someone who's together in marriage. But according to Rabbi Akiva, remember, all of the chayvei lavin don't have kedusha, right? That's Rabbi Akiva's opinion, and they become a mamzer in all those cases. So how could ki tihiyeh leish zar mean when you're married? It can't mean that. It must mean when you sleep with, right? Says the Gemara, well, the Rabbi Akiva, the Amar ein kedushin tovsim b'chayvei lavin. that Kiddushin does not take effect in an Isser Lav, so then obviously the word Kitiyah cannot mean when you're together in marriage. My Kitiyah, Lishzar, it must be Kiti Ba'el, when you actually sleep with them, right? It can't be a marriage. There is no marriage according to the Akiva. It must be you fool around, you have intercourse. So then, if that's the case, then everyone who's pasul should be included in one pasuk, right? According to the Chachamim, you need the two psukim. One to tell you the people you can legally marry who are pasul to you, and one to tell you the people you can't legally marry, like a non-Jew. But according to Rabbi Akiva, you can't legally marry anybody who's pasul to you. So why do you need two psukim? Why do you need one of Kitiyah Ishzar and a second of Almanah Grusha? So according to Rabbi Akiva, where are we? Almanah v'Grusha lamali. Says the Gemara, that's to tell you a very interesting and separate halacha, which is related. Almanah is lahachmir aleh. It's to tell you, now you might have thought, a bat kohen marries a Yisrael, right? She grew up in her father's house as a bat kohen, she eat truma. She marries a Yisrael. She is now not a bat kohen anymore because she's married to Yisrael. If he dies, maybe you would think she loses that status, even if she has a child. Meaning, even if she's a kid, it doesn't matter. The fact is, she's a bat kohen. So the Torah is telling you that if almanah is lahachmir aleh, that even if though she's a widow, she still goes back and cannot be in her father's house if she has a child. And a grusha is the opposite, is lachkel aleh. Because you might have thought, right? Tzricha, says Gemara, you need it. James, thanks for joining us. We are around 15 lines from the top. But iyashma inan almanah, if you only told me the halacha in yesterday's parsha, Parshat Emor, that a woman a bat kohen who marries a Yisrael and then her husband dies, right? So she's a widow, that she goes back to her father's house. I would have thought that only makes sense if the marriage ends through death, right? Almanah hu dechilet lezera achla. And almanah can go back to her father's house if she has no children and eat truma. You know why? Because she can marry a kohen, right? Almanah can marry another kohen if she wanted to, or if they wanted to. Mishum dechazia lekuhuna. Aval grusha, but if a bat kohen marries Yisrael and that marriage ends in divorce, she can't marry a kohen ever again because she's a divorced woman, right? So you might have thought a grusha, even though she's a bat kohen and she's not married anymore, maybe she can't eat truma. She can no longer marry a kohen. Ema, you might have thought, even if she has no children, lo achla, she can't eat truma. So that's why the Torah had to say no. Even a grusha, if you break up the marriage, you lose the status of married to Yisrael and you go back to bat kohen. And the opposite, iyashmin and grusha, the Torah only said a bat kohen who marries and gets divorced goes back to her father. I would have thought, well, that's true. Grushahu dechi itle zera. If she has a child, she doesn't go back home. Lo achla. Why? Because now she's got a kid, which connects her to her Yisrael husband, and she can't marry a kohen ever again because she's divorced. Right? Mishum de lo chazi lekuhuna, she can never marry another kohen. Aval almanah, but a widow, even if she has a kid, she can go and marry a person who's a kohen, be a wife of a kohen. Maybe she can eat truma, even though she has a kid from the Yisrael. Aval almanah de chazi lekuhuna, ima, you might have thought, afagav itle zeranami techal, and therefore tzricha. Therefore, you need both. Okay. Ask the Gemara just two more questions, and we're going to move on to the next thing. So, if you're
bottom line is, if she has a kid, she can't.
The bottom line is she has a kid and she's a bat kohen and has a kid, but obviously for a bat Yisrael it does the opposite, remember, right? A bat Yisrael marries a kohen, even if her husband dies, she eats truma as long as she has a kid from the husband.
Right. She's still connected to her husband.
It's connected, correct. And again, it's not just kids, it could be grandkids, and we're going to see today.
A bat kohen married to a kohen would also be able to eat truma.
Yeah, but that's the whole different issue. Because she's a kohen. He's a kohen, she's a kohen. Right. Doesn't matter who she's connected to.
Okay.
We're going to get to a very interesting case later if everyone keeps their, the relationship straight, of where you have a bat kohen who marries a Yisrael and they have a daughter who then marries a kohen. Right? And then they have a son. So that grandson can help her mother eat, but prohibits her grandmother from eating. Right? Okay. Well, we'll get there later. Okay. It's later today. So stay tuned. Says the Gemara, well, what about Machzir Grushato? This is one exception. Remember, this is always a case that we talk about as being somewhat separate. Remember, the halacha is that if a person is married and they get divorced, a person can remarry as long as he's not a Kohen. He can remarry his divorced wife, right? The wife he divorced. But if she marries someone else, he no longer can remarry her. And that's called the prohibition. It's a lotase of machzir grushato, okay? But it's kedushin is chal, and there's no, the limitations are not the same as with all the other cases. So ask the Gemara, maybe machzir grushato also, if a bat kohen married or slept, with a man who was machzir grushato, she should become pasul too, and we know that's not the case. Ask the Gemara, where am I? Ve'ema nivelet the pasula, that a bat kohen who sleeps with a man who's pasul to her would include even machzir grushato. There's more, they can't be. Because remember, the terminology in the pasuk was the ish zar, a bat kohen who sleeps with a foreigner. Person she was once married to is not a foreigner, right? Amar Achmana, Misha zar etzla meikar, lafukehai delo zar etzla meikar. He's not a foreigner to her. Says, well, if that's the case, what about a halal? This is also a very important halacha, which I think every time I read it, I have to remember that it's true, which is that a lot of the prohibitions that we're going to talk about today, even and further, don't apply to men and women equally. Meaning, a Kohen is not allowed to sleep or marry a halala. Right? A halala is a woman or a person who is a Kohen whose parents slept with someone inappropriate. A Kohen sleeps with a divorced woman. Their children are halalim, a man or a halala if it's a female. A Kohen is not allowed to marry. It's a pasuk. Isha zona v'chalala lo yikach. Right? A Kohen's not allowed to marry a halala. There's no prohibition on a bat Kohen marrying a halal. Right? There's absolutely no prohibition. Obviously, she won't be able to eat truma. He's not he's not a Kohen. But there's no such prohibition. So the question now is, what about if you have a bat Kohen who sleeps with a halal? Why does she become pasul to eat truma? Right? Ihachi halal, the lav zaru meikar lo lifsal. He shouldn't make her pasul. Right? They're not foreigners. He's allowed to sleep with her. It's totally permitted. Markra says the Gemara, the pasuk says, lo yichalel zaro ba'amav. Pasuk says, this is by Kohen Gadol, that a Kohen Gadol should not sleep with a woman he's not allowed to sleep with, let's say an almanah, a divorced woman, and he shouldn't make his children into chalalim. And we are makish zaro lo. You make a hekesh, you make a comparison of the children of this, the offspring of this marriage or this illicit union between a Kohen Gadol and almanah to the actual person. That mahu posel, just like he becomes posel, meaning that the Kohen Gadol, not the Kohen Gadol, the child is pasul, comes from this union. Af zaro nami posel. So just like he, by having the act, can pasul a woman, the almanah becomes pasul by sleeping with the Kohen Gadol. So too, the children make her pasul. Says the Gemara, well, maybe it's only true mishat havaya. Maybe it's only true, havaya means marriage, right? The time you live marriage. If you just sleep together, maybe it doesn't apply. Says Gemara, no, dumya de kohen gadol ba'almana. We learn this, derive this halacha from the prohibition of a kohen gadol and almana. And as we learned before, ma kohen gadol ba'almana bidbi'ah, it says that a kohen gadol cannot actually sleep with the almana, not just get married to her. Afhai nami bidbi'ah. So it's only the act of bi'ah that prohibits these illicit relationships. Ask them, maybe we need both. Maybe we need to get married and sleep together, and either one alone would not be enough to pasul a woman. Says Gemara again, dunya de kohen gadol ba'almana. It's again, we learn it from kohen gadol and almana. Ma kohen gadol ba'almana bebi'ah lechuda, afnam kainami bebi'ah lechuda. So it's not marriage that matters here. It's only sleeping together. And so again, the halacha, the Tanakama, just to remind everyone, is that a bat kohen sleeps with a person who's asur to her, he becomes asur from eating truma. And not just a bat kohen, but also a bat yisrael, right? So any person, and a bat levi, any woman who sleeps with a man who's asur to her becomes asur to eat truma and to ever marry a kohen again. Okay, period. Remember that yesterday, at the end of the Braita, we had two other opinions about what happens. And Rabbi Yossi said, so I don't know if everyone's got this, this is like 2/3 of the way down. Rabbi Yossi, Omer, the second word on the line, I don't know if anyone needs help finding it. Tosis says Shnehem to the left of it, like 3 lines down from that. So Rabbi Yossi Omer, Okay, now follow the words carefully because they're very specific. Kol shezaro pasul, anyone whose children, the offspring of this union, will be pasul, that will be posel. If the kids are a problem, then that act of bi'ah that makes the kids will prohibit the woman from eating truma, posel. But kol she'ein zaro pasul, if the children are not pasul, ain't a posel. So what's the case? My ika ben Tanakama Rabbi Yossi. I said this yesterday. Rabbi Yochanan mitzri sheni v'adomi sheni ika beinayo. Remember the Torah says the mitzri v'adomi lo yavo bekal Hashem. Right? Then it says dar shlishi udar revi'i yavo heina. That the third generation, remember, they convert. So a mitzri converts. That man, let's say, is generation 1. His children are mitzri sheni. Again, they're Jewish, but they're mitzri sheni. They cannot sleep with a regular Jew, meaning not a mitzri. But dar shlishi, the third generation, can. So let's say a kohen sleeps with a woman who's a mitzri sheni, or no, sorry, take the man. There's a man who's a mitzri sheni, and he sleeps with a bat kohen who's a bat kohen, right? So their child would be mutter because the child would be a mitzri shlishi, right? So according to Rabbi Yossi, she can still eat truma because even though she was not allowed to do this act was prohibited. But since the offspring would be permitted, she's permitted too. Okay, and shneim lolam du al mikohen gadol ba'amana. They both, the Tanakamu says it's usher, and Rabbi Yossi says not that it's usher, but that the woman does not become usher to eat truma. Learn from a kohen gadol ba'amana. Tanakama savar. Tanakama says, well, the reason is that ma kohen gadol ba'almana should be adoba avera. They're not allowed to sleep together, kohen gadol and almana, and therefore apostles, the woman. Av hainami posel. This woman's not allowed to sleep with the mitzri sheni, so the act of intercourse makes her pasul to a kohen. And Rabbi Yossi says, no. Kohen gadol, not kohen gadol, zaro pasul. The kohen gadol sleeps with an almana, that child is pasul for kuhuna. That child becomes a halal. Right? So here too, that's where it's posel. Afkol shezaro pasul is posel. La'afuke mitzri sheni, to exclude a bat kohen or any woman who sleeps with a mitzri sheni. The ein zaro pasul, their child is not going to be pasul. Because the Torah says, banim asher yoldu lahem dar shlishi yavo lahem b'kal Hashem. That the third generation is allowed to actually marry anybody, and so therefore according to Rabbi Yossi, that would not pasul the mother, even though she did something wrong. Right? She wasn't supposed to sleep with him, but it does not pasul her from eating truma. Okay? Continues the Gemara, we're now at the 2 dots, 10 lines from the bottom. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said another detail. He said, no, it's not a question of whether the children are pasul. It's a question of whether you can marry the daughter. Interesting, right? This man and this woman slept together. If they had a daughter and it would be permitted for someone to marry this daughter, meaning a regular Jew to marry this daughter, then that act of intercourse did not make her pasul the kuhuna, right? Says Reb Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Kol she'ata se pito, ata nosei almanuto. If you can marry the daughter, you can marry this woman who had the improper relationship. Her husband died, so now she's not married to him anymore. You can marry her if you're a kohen, or you can have her eat truma if she's a bat kohen. Says the Gemara, Ma'ika ben Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. What's the difference between them? Amer Ula, very importantly, Ger Amoni Umoavi Ika beinayo. Let's say the guy who sleeps with this bat kohen is a convert who came from Ammon and Moab. So remember, the Torah says that Ammon and Moab lo yavo lahem b'kal Hashem. They can never marry. Ador Asili, right? They can never marry into Kal Hashem. And she married this guy. Right? Let's say Kedusha's Tovsin or not Tovsin, doesn't really matter. But they married, says the Tanakh, says Rabbi Yossi, since the child will be prohibited, right? Because the child will be an Ammoni and Moavi also. Therefore, she's pasul to kahuna once she marries him, or once she sleeps with him. Says Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, no, because you know who's not pasul? Their daughter. Because the daughter of a ger Ammoni is totally permitted, b'kal Hashem. Right? Like Ruth HaMoaviyah. Right, so the whole prohibition of an Ammoni and Moavi only applies to men; it doesn't apply to women. And so, since the daughter would be permitted, even if they had a son or had no child, she would be permitted to eat truma. Says Reb Shimon Gamliel, Ger Ammoni and Moavi ika beinayo. And again, Shneim lo lamdu el mi kohen gadol ba'almana. They both learned it out from the case of a kohen gadol who slept with an almana, which is where the Torah says she becomes halal. Because Rabbi Yossi Savar, look, a kohen gadol marries an almana, the zaro pasul. The child carries that on. The child becomes a halal or halala here too, and therefore it's posel. Afkol here too by an Ammoni, a Moavi, Ammon and Moav, a ger Ammon and Moav. If they have a son, that son is pasul. Afkol shazaro pasul will be posel. And Shimon Gamliel says it's true that if they have a son, it will be pasul, but if they have a daughter, she won't be. And so ma kohen gadol b'almana kol zaro pasul. A kohen gadol marries an almana, whether they have a boy or a girl, their pasul is a halal or halala, but therefore you're posel. But here it's only af kol shazaro pasul upasul afuke amoni or moavi the ain kol zaro pasul. Not all of the offspring of a relationship between a ger amoni and moavi and a bat Yisrael or bat kohen will be pasul. The amar amoni velo amonit moavi velo moavit, right? An amoni and not an ammonit, and a moavi and not a moavit, which is why David HaMelech was not considered to be inappropriate, right?
It's a little counterintuitive, right? Because the more severe prohibition, if it's a girl,
Sure.
she's okay. Whereas the mitzri is a less severe, and you know what I mean?
Yeah. So I'll say I don't want to tip it off, but if next week or next Monday, I think, or maybe next Sunday, there's a whole sugya because this was obviously a very sore subject in Jewish history because David HaMelech was the product of an Ammoni, a Moavi, sorry, as we're about to talk about in Ruth, right? And so if you don't say Ammoni velo Ammonit, David HaMelech would be illicit, right? Which would make a lot of problems for his kingdom, right? So we're going to discuss that. I got it in a week, which is perfect time for Shavuot, but it's true. It is. There were those who argued very strongly differently and said that David was not correct. Continues the Mishnah, a next detail, and we quoted this Mishnah a little bit yesterday because it's really just the second part of the first Mishnah, which is, remember the first Mishnah was that a bat Yisrael or bat Kohen who sleeps with the man she's not allowed to sleep with is pasul lekuna. But what if she just sleeps with someone who's not pasul to her, but she's not married to? So let's say she's raped, a ones, to a man who she could have married, right? Not a non-Jew or not something like that, but she just slept with them. I mean, she didn't choose to. It was forced on her. Or mifateh, or she did choose to. She just had a relationship outside of marriage, right? But not anything illegal, right? So she's not married otherwise. Or if they're shoteh, or if let's say the man has no dat, and therefore he can't do any marriage. So then the fact that they slept together doesn't do anything. Lo poslin, but lo machilin. She doesn't become possible for eating truma. She doesn't be allowed to eat truma. But if the person she slept with cannot marry into Yisrael, which is what we said yesterday. Let's say, this is an interesting last line of the daf. Okay, hare changes the word hayan to hare. Yisrael shaba bat kohen. So fascinating. Again, these halachot are really, really interesting. We don't really do them because we don't need truma. But let's say you have a man who's a Yisrael who sleeps with a bat kohen, right? Not in marriage. They're not married at all. Okay, they just have an affair, but not an affair because she's not married. They just have a premarital sex. We'll call it. So then tochal b'truma, she can keep eating truma because she's not married to the Yisrael. She just slept with him, right? So remember, if Yisrael marries a bat kohen, she can't eat truma, but if he just sleeps with her, she can eat truma. Okay, got that? Mm-hmm. Turn the page, daf bet. Ibra, if she becomes pregnant from this out of marriage, out of wedlock relationship, then lo tochal b'truma, she's not allowed to eat truma while she's pregnant. Okay, we'll see why. Well, we said that yesterday. Why? Because it says she goes back to her beit avia kin hureh. She goes back to her father's house like when she was a kid. She wasn't pregnant when she was a kid. Okay, but nechtacha ubar b'me'el, if she has an abortion, right? If the kid is cut out of her womb, Rashi says this means, of course, also if the kid's born and dies. But if that kid is no longer there, or the fetus is no longer there, then tochal. Then she goes back home and eats truma because she was never married to a Yisrael. She just slept with him. Now, what about the next case? Hari Kohen Shaba Bat Yisrael. Let's say the opposite. Let's say you have a Kohen who sleeps with, again, outside of marriage, sleeps with a Bat Yisrael. So she can't eat truma because they're not married, right? Lo tochal b'truma. But Ibra, if she becomes pregnant, she still can't eat truma because she doesn't have a kid. Lo tochal b'truma. But fascinatingly, Yolda, if she gives birth, so remember this halacha, she slept with him outside of marriage, right? Wasn't illegal, right? She wasn't married to somebody else and they weren't related, but she slept with him. There was no kedushin, there was no marriage. If she gives birth to the child, she can eat truma. So fascinatingly, a child allows you to eat truma even if you're not married. Okay, so Yolda tocha. Nimsa turns out ben gadol mishal av. This child is more powerful than her father because the father slept with her and she didn't eat truma, right? But the kid was born and she can eat truma. So the kid is more powerful than the relationship with the father. Okay. Ha'eved, now a slave. Now slaves always mean eved Knani, who's not fully Jewish, so he's treated like a non-Jew. He who if he sleeps with a woman, let's say, he can be posel, mishum bi'ah. If he sleeps with her, she becomes pasul, as we learned yesterday. A batnis kohen who sleeps with an eved becomes pasul from eating truma. But eno posel mishum zera. But if they have a child, that doesn't become pasul because it doesn't count as her child. So if a bat kohen sleeps with a slave and she gives birth, she's as if she never had a child. Okay, so she can eat truma from her father's stuff. Ketzad. Bat Yisrael Kohen, she's a Bat Yisrael and marries a Kohen, or a Bat Kohen Yisrael. B'yodah himenu ben, and she then gives birth to a son. So this is a Jewish son. She's a Bat Yisrael or Bat Kohen, marries the opposite tribe, and gives birth to a son. And that son, halach ben b'nichbash al shivcha, he forces himself. It's just like an ugly language for intercourse. He just forces himself on a slave. Okay. And Yolda himenu ben, they give birth to a child. So what is that child? The product of a Yisrael and a slave. It's a slave, right? Harei zeh eved. That child is an eved. He's not a Jewish child. The child is an eved, Kenani, okay? And therefore, that child doesn't count as zera for the purposes of eating truma. So hayda ein aviv, if his grandmother is a bat Yisrael Kohen, is a bat Yisrael married a Kohen, and everyone else in the family dies except for this young child who's a slave, lo tochal b'truma. She can't eat truma because she doesn't have a child. She doesn't have a grandchild. And the opposite is true as well. Let's say she's a bat kohen married to Yisrael, so she no longer eats truma as long as she has children, right? Everybody died. Her husband died. Her son died. She has this grandson who's a slave. It doesn't matter. It doesn't count, right? Because it doesn't count as her grandson because he's a slave. So tochal b'truma, she can eat truma because it doesn't count as a kid. On the other hand, says our Mishnah, if the grandchild's a mamzer, it does count as her kid. Okay? A mamzer would be posel if he sleeps with a woman because she becomes pasul for kuna, and ma'achil, but he allows his grandmother to eat truma, right? So think of that case. A grandchild, remember we said a grandmother, let's say a bat Yisrael, marries a Kohen, okay? Her husband, the Kohen, dies, so she no longer eats truma. But if she has a child, she can still eat truma. Let's say she has a son, and that son married a person he's not allowed to marry. Let's say a non-Jew, or, well, if you call that a mamzer, that's what our Mishnah's case is, but it's machloket. But he marries someone he's not allowed to marry, and there's a grandson who's a mamzer. But the fact is that she has a grandson. And since she has a grandson, she can eat truma. Okay? So even though he's totally illicit and not a Kohen, of course, she can eat truma. So says the Mishnah, how's that case? Ketzad, Bat Yisrael the Kohen. Let's see if a Bat Yisrael marries a Kohen or Bat Kohen the Yisrael. Yodahi menu bat. They have a daughter. And then she goes, she marries someone, a slave or or someone who would make a mamzer. Yodahi menu ben, they have a son. This grandson, Hariza mamzer. He's totally prohibited from marrying B'kal Hashem. Okay? But if his grandmother, if his grandmother was a Bat Yisrael married a Kohen, she can keep eating truma because she has a grandson. Right? Tochal b'truma. And if she was a Bat Kohen li Yisrael, then she can't eat truma because she has a grandson. Lo tochal b'truma. So what does it turn out? This is we're still in the Mishnah at the Dalet, if you can see it. You have a Kohen Gadol. Listen to this case. Don't forget this one. You can have a Kohen Gadol. So pamim hu posel. Sometimes you have a Kohen Gadol who pasels his family from eating truma. How could that be? Ketzad. Right? Because you have a grandson or a son who's a Kohen Gadol, you can't eat truma. How could that be? Ketzad, says the Mishnah. Let's say you have a Bat Kohen li Yisrael. You have a woman, a daughter of a Kohen, right? She marries a regular Yisrael. So she no longer can eat truma because she's married to Yisrael, right? And Yelda Himenu Bat. And she has a daughter. So her daughter is like the daughter's father. The daughter is a Bat Yisrael. And the daughter, Holcha Bat Miseit the Kohen. The daughter goes and marries a Kohen, like her mother, right? Her mother was a Bat Kohen, not her mother, not married a Kohen. But she goes and she marries a Kohen. Remember the case then. So a Bat Kohen marries a Yisrael. They have a daughter. She marries a Kohen. And they have a son. And that son is the greatest Kohen in the world. He becomes the Kohen Gadol. Right? So the son, the grandson, is a Kohen Gadol. But the reality is that since this is a grandson from her union of a Bat Yisrael to a Bat Kohen to Yisrael, she's never able to eat Truma. Because since the bloodline of the Yisrael is still alive, the Kohen Gadol prohibits her from eating Truma. Right? Niseit Kohen v'yalda imenu ben, hareza ra'ui liyot Kohen Gadol, he could be the Kohen Gadol, but Omedu mishamesh agabi mizbeach, he gets up and he's the Kohen Gadol working on the mizbeach in Yom Kippur, machilat imo, right? His mother eats because of him, because his mother married a Kohen, had a son who's a Kohen, and so as long as he's alive, she can eat. But posel ein imo, but he apostles his grandmother from eating Truma. And Zot Omer, this is how people say, I don't make my grandchildren be like the Kohanim Gedolim who pass me from Truma, right? Nebuch, we shouldn't have such grandchildren. Lo kehani b'nei Kohen Gadol shu poslani min ha-Truma. I don't want to have grandchildren like this who make me puzzle from Truma. Of course, it's just a joke, right? Because any grandchild would puzzle, even if the grandchild was a bum, right? So, but the point is that it's fascinating that you can have a grandchild who's a Kohen Gadol, or a Kohen, let's just say, but because he exists, the grandmother or great-grandmother or whoever can no longer eat Truma. Okay?
I think this is a rare case where the Mishnah has a joke in it.
It's true. It is a good, I think it's time. We need a joke right around now.
Yeah.
This kind of day.
Yeah.
Okay, says the Gemara. Tanina la d'Tana Rabbanan, our Mishnah is in fact telling us something that we know from a Braita, that Shoteh v'Katan, a person who is not considered to have dat, a person who is insane, as we would say, and a katan, a person who's less than the age, shenasu nashim v'meitu, if they marry a woman and they die, it was as if they were never married. Nishotem turot min hachalitza u'min ha'yibum. Those widows don't have to do chalitza or yibum. They were never really married. It just was a game, so to speak. It was a charade, okay? Because a katan and a shoteh cannot get married. Keitzad, continue our Mishnah. Hare Yisrael Shabbat Bat Kohen Tocha B'Truma. Again, the case here is we're second wide line. A Bat Kohen, daughter of a Kohen, sleeps not in marriage. Sleeps with a Yisrael sleeps with a Bat Kohen. She can keep eating Truma because since they weren't married, they just had sex outside of marriage. She doesn't become pasul l'kuna, and she doesn't become pasul to eat Truma. She wasn't married to him, right? But if she becomes pregnant, lo tochal. Says the Gemara, I don't understand. Kiva ibralo tochal. If you say that a woman, a bat kohen who becomes pregnant from Yisrael cannot eat truma, how could a woman who's not pregnant eat truma as well, bat kohen? Maybe she's pregnant, right? Every time she sleeps with the Yisrael, she might become pregnant. So you don't know if she's pregnant, but how could you say she's usher if she becomes pregnant? Even if you don't know if she's pregnant, you have to assume maybe she was pregnant. That's how pregnancy works, right? Given the Ibra lo tochal, since if she was pregnant, she couldn't eat truma, why don't you lecha shema Ibra? Why don't you worry every time they sleep together, maybe she became pregnant? Milo tznan, didn't we have a Mishnah earlier that said that if you have a person who sleeps together, remember this was a guy who slept with the wrong sister, remember, and he wanted to marry the other one. So it said, mafrishin otan shlosha chadashim, you have to separate the marriage for 3 months, shema mu'baratin. Maybe they're pregnant. Right? Remember, it was 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and each one slept with the wrong one. But either way, it says you have to worry that maybe they became pregnant. So you have to wait 3 months. Amarabba barafuna, no. That was the yuchsin chashishim. There they were worried about yichus. We don't know which man slept with which woman. We don't know which son is going to go to who. So you got to wait 3 months. So you know if she's pregnant, and if she's not, then she can marry the next guy, and you know if she has a kid, who it comes from. But l'truma lo chashishu. But truma was not as big a concern because what's the big deal? If you by mistake eat truma, you did something wrong, but you didn't ruin the whole genealogy of your people. Why is that true? The truma lo chashashu. Is it true that we don't worry about truma? Vatanya, there's a Braita that says. So this is another case that we're going to have a lot of in Seder Nashim, which is remember, if a man marries a woman and he dies without children, she's in big trouble, right? Because she's got to do yibam or chalitza to his brothers. and let's say his brothers are not so nice, right? Or his brothers want to marry her and she doesn't want to marry them, or they're young, or they're hard, or they travel and they live in Russia and you can never get to them, right? Which is a big problem people have. Or let's say the brother lives far away, you got to wait for them to come back. So what the husband says to his wife is, look, I'm afraid I'm going to die, right? We don't have children. I don't want you to have to fall to my siblings, my brothers. So here's a get. An hour before I die, this get should be chal. So whenever I turn out to die, you were divorced already. Okay, so it's a get al t'nai. 1 hour, 1 moment before I die, you should be divorced. The problem, of course, is that if she's a Kohen and she's a Bat Yisrael, she can no longer eat truma because she never knows when he's going to die. And maybe she's eating truma and he's dead, right? Or he's about to die. Every moment he could be about to die. So if the get is chal 15 minutes before his death, and she's eating truma and he's sitting with her at the table, he might choke and die. So says the Braita, asura lechal b'truma miyad. So what do you see from here? That you worry for all these far, right? So why don't you worry that sex is going to turn into a baby, right? I mean, that's something that happens too. Amar Rabba Barafuna, you're right, but we only worry b'nisuin chashashin. I don't really know how to explain this too well, but we only really worry when they're married. When they're married, she wants to become pregnant. And so we worry that there's not a higher likelihood maybe of becoming pregnant, but a higher likelihood she's going to do things to keep a pregnancy. But biznut lo chashashu. But if they're in mizaneh, presumably they're not trying to have a baby, they're just sleeping around. And there, it's a lower chance of her becoming pregnant. I don't know about biologically, but maybe, she can do things that will not protect the baby.
We had that yesterday, right, with the moch and the...
Right, it was a couple of days ago, yeah, so that she can use protection, as we say, we call it now. She could turn over, right? The Gemara has all these different things. So, biznut lo chashashu. Says the Gemara, is it true that by nisiyun mi chashashu? Watanya, we learned in another Braita, let's say you have a bat kohen shenisei to Yisrael, right? You have a bat kohen who's married to Yisrael, so once she gets married, she no longer can eat truma, right? Because she's married to Yisrael. And he drops dead, he dies, umeit. Says the Braita, okay, go back home. Tovelet v'chad b'truma la'erev. She can go home that night and eat truma. She gets to go to the mikvah because she slept with him, but she goes to the mikvah, and as soon as it gets dark, she can eat truma. What? Maybe she's pregnant, right? You said if she's pregnant from a Yisrael, she no longer can eat truma. So why don't you have to wait 3 months to see if she's pregnant, right? They were married. Amar Rav Chisda, well, that's not what we mean. We mean tovelet v'ochelt ad arba'im. She can go to the mikvah and eat truma for 40 days after they slept together. Why? Because ilo ma'abra, because look, if she's not pregnant, then there's nothing to worry about. She's not pregnant. Halo ma'abra. Ma'abra, this also is a really, really critical Gemara. 40 days after conception, there's no such, it's not a fetus. It's just water. Ad arba'im maya ba'almei. There's no baby for 40 days. There's no fetus for 40 days. Sounds like a controversial subject now. But even, it's not even called an ubar for 40 days. It's called water. Maya ba'almei. It's just called, a developing, seed. So therefore, even if she does become pregnant from this intercourse, the first 40 days of pregnancy are not considered to be pregnant. And so therefore, she can eat truma during that time. After 40 days, she'd have to stop. So you don't know if you're pregnant, we say probably till 3 months. So from 40 days to 3 months, she wouldn't be able to eat truma. But up till 40 days, she can go home and eat truma, right? Ad arba'im, it's maya ba'almahi. Amrle abaya ihachi. I don't get it. Look at the next words in the bright. Ema Seif. It says, Hukar ubra b'me'eha. If they identify that she has a fetus in her womb, so she starts showing that she's pregnant, it turns out turns out that she's messed up. She ate all this truma that she wasn't allowed to eat back retroactively. Well, you're telling me you don't have to worry about it retroactively because it wasn't even a baby. No. My mikukelet ad arba'im, meaning from 40 days after they slept together until she recognized she was pregnant, if she ate truma during that time, she's going to be messed up, right? Because she's not allowed to eat truma. She have to pay back the coin. She stole from a coin. It wasn't hers. But up till 40 days, there's no such thing as pregnancy. And so even though in this halacha, which again, obviously has implications, but even though a pregnant woman cannot eat truma, a woman she is pregnant, right? Remember, her husband's dead. He slept with her. He's dead. So the seed is in her, right? The zera is there. But for 40 days, it's not considered to be pregnancy. It's just considered to be maya ba'alma. just water, and therefore she can eat truma during that time. After 40 days, she has to stop, wait till 3 months probably. And then if at 3 months she's not pregnant, she can keep eating truma. Okay?
What, I don't understand. Oh, the 40, if she,
We don't consider there to be a
yeah, I know,
fifth.
but if she is pregnant, so she could do for 40 days.
So if she slept, let's say she got married, slept with him once, and then he died. Obviously, if she slept with him a lot of times, it could be 40 days many times, right?
After 3 months, she can't.
No, after 3 months, she can. She slept with the man. But
But she can after 3 months. I got it. Thank you. All right, I got
So
it.
from 40 days to 3 months would be the gray zone.
Right, I got it. Yes.
Itmar. Now, one more halacha. We'll do this in the last 8 minutes before, I know what time mincha is, but we're going to.
7:55. I want to leave in a few minutes. So.
Okay, well, we're just going to do a few more lines.
Yeah.
I'll stop and, well, we're not going to finish. But Itmar, very important halacha. Haba al arusato bebeit chamiv. A man sleeps with his fiance when she's living in her father's house. Remember, they would do kiddushin, which is binding marriage, eshet ish, but she would stay in her father's house until the nisuin. Nisuin is when he brought her into his own house, the chuppah, right? So from kiddushin, she's living at home. He goes for a visit and he sleeps with her, and then she gets pregnant and has a kid. Okay, so they didn't do the chuppah yet. They had kiddushin. He slept with her. She became pregnant. She's walking down the aisle pregnant, but it's his kid.
Mm-hmm.
Says what?
Yep.
That's the kid. Well, he thinks it's his kid. Says Rav, it's not his kid. Avlad mamzer. A kid's a mamzer because if she slept with him when she wasn't supposed to, she slept with other people, and so you have to assume that kid comes from someone else. And she's an eshet ish because she already had kiddushin. She got pregnant. The kid's a mamzer. Shmuel says no, Avlad shtuki. The Vlad is a shtuki. Remember, shtuki was a kid who, shatuk means be quiet. When they say to the kid, who's your father, the mother says, be quiet. So you have doubts. We don't really know who the father is. But that doesn't mean it was bad. It just means you don't know. So says Shmuel, it's a gray zone. It's a kid who's a shtuki, who's a suffix mamzer, basically. But it's not considered to be a mamzer, meaning they can marry. They're just not ideal. Amar Rava, says Rava, well, I can prove Rav from our Mishnah. Mistavra milte de Rav, the daima me alma. Rav probably only said that this kid is a mamzer if there's a daima. Rashi's a daima means like a rumor that she's sleeping with anybody. Alma means the whole world, right? Anybody. Meaning there's a rumor that this woman is just sleeping with anyone, including people who are not her fiance. Avolo daima me alma, if there's no rumor that she's sleeping with other men, then batra didei shadina, you assume it's from her husband, it's from her fiance. How do we know that? I'm a Rava Minan Minala. Why do I assume that that's what Rav is saying? The Katani, because our Mishnah says, remember our Mishnah, right? You have a bat Yisrael who sleeps with a Kohen out of marriage, right? They're not married. It says she can't eat truma, but if she has a baby, she can eat truma. How do you know it's his baby, right? They're not married. She's sleeping with this guy. So Yalda, it says Tocha. Yechidami, I don't get it. How do you know it's his? If there's a rumor that this woman is sleeping with anybody, meaning other people, then Yalda might tochal. If she gives birth, how can she eat? Ella, it might not be his. Elav, it must be that minei daima. There's a rumor that she's sleeping with this man, the Kohen, they're in love, but lo daima me alma, but she's not sleeping with anybody else, right? And therefore, that's why we assume it's his, and he can eat truma. The mother can eat truma. But ma hatam. Right? She's not married to anybody, so she's really not allowed to sleep with any of these people. But you still say batra didei shadina lei, that if people see them together and with no one else, you assume it's his kid. Hacha, here by a woman who's engaged, right, and slept and got pregnant. She can sleep with this guy when she has nisuin any time, and she's also to somebody else. Lo kol shekain. Amar Abaya says, no, I would not agree with that. I would tell you that Kohecha the Daima Mina, Nine, even if there's only a rumor that she slept with this guy, even if there's no rumor that she slept with anybody else, Amar Rav Havlad Mamzer. Rav would say that a woman who's engaged, who gets pregnant, even if she claims, and her husband claims, and her fiance claims that it's his kid, that they're sleeping together, you assume the kid's a mamzer. My timer, Da'arinam, because we say, Mida Afikere Nafsha Legabi Arus, since she behaved inappropriately, again, this time, in that time, it was highly inappropriate. and she was mafkir herself. She made herself free and didn't follow the rules to sleep with her fiance. She also is considered to be hefker to anybody else, and therefore she is not trusted to have just slept with him, and you assume the kid's a mamzer. So now what about our Mishnah? How in the world, when you said a woman who was not married, slept with the Kohen, she has a baby, the kid's, she's allowed to eat truma. How do you know it's his kid, right? If she's free or loose enough to sleep with him, she could have slept with anybody, according to this logic. Says the Gemara, Mas Nisan, a Mishnah has to be where they're in prison together. So there was no chance for her to sleep with anybody else. So that's where we can rely, or whatever the circumstances was, right? But they were stuck together in one spot and there were other people. And so therefore, if she got pregnant, it was only from him. So we know for a fact that was from the Kohen. Of course, today we could probably do 23andMe, or some other version. But that's the halacha, according to the first opinion. Tomorrow we'll get to the second opinion.
I mean, they're kind of assuming that she's at fault rather than him. I mean, like, why do they?
No. I mean, I think they might do the same thing. They might assume he sleeps with a lot of people too. But that's irrelevant. She's the one who had the baby, right?
Yeah, I know, but it might have been his, initiative or something. But,
Well, right. No, but here we're talking about cases where obviously it's not rape. If it was rape, you wouldn't assume this at all, right?
no, I understand, but I mean, like.
Yeah, no, I think we're assuming about both. But of course, for her, the implication is who's the father, right?
Right.
And so there's no way to prove it in those days. So that's what you have to really rely on.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Ollie.
Okay, Shavua Tov, everyone.
Shavua Tov.